Chapter 5 is the dreaded chapter that students always say that this is horrible, I don't want to learn this, I've memorized it before, and then I dumped it out of my brain so I had room for something else. I don't want you to think of metabolism as something horrific to learn. It was for me. I probably didn't really understand metabolism until it was my turn to teach it. And I decided, you know what, I'm going to figure something out different because I'm not going to torture my students the way I was tortured. My husband makes fun of me. I still have poster boards. When I took metabolism, our teacher made us memorize every little step, every little piece, every little part. I had 8 poster boards, and I would lay them out on the floor like a puzzle, and I drew the pathways, and I had to have 8 pieces of poster board for everything to fit on there. And then we would stand over it, and we would walk around and study and memorize all the steps and how everything went together. This is when me and Miss Causey were in college together, and we would stay up late at night with our poster boards, memorizing all of this stuff. And you know what? I didn't remember it. I would memorize it, take a test. I was a nerd. I'd make 100 on the test, and then the next day I couldn't have told you any of it. That's pointless, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to learn some of the steps, but we're going to learn why we go through the steps. I think the why is a lot more important than memorizing something you can look up in a book. Okay? My job as a teacher is to explain the why. Okay? So as you study this and as you start to learn these pathways, do not try to memorize the steps. I'm never going to ask you that. Now, I know most of them, and you will start picking them up as you do it over and over again. But how many of you have ever had to memorize any of these pathways? Where glucose becomes glucose 6-phosphate. That turns into glucose 1,6-bisphosphate. Splits into 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. I mean, it's horrific to memorize it, and it's pointless. So don't memorize. So let's do a few things to get your mind in the right spot. Okay, first off, quick review of what enzymes are. Enzymes catalyze reactions. Okay, so the enzyme is what makes you convert one thing into another. So a little terminology. When we go through these types of reactions, we're going to have a substrate. The substrate is the beginning. It's what you start with. It's the start product. Okay? If you have an enzyme to make the reaction go, you will quickly turn your substrate into product. So the product is what you make. If you have a reaction like this, you're trying to make product. That's the goal. Okay? So the way it works is the substrate comes in, what you start with, binds the enzyme changes it somehow, and then releases the product. Okay? So you're going to have substrates and products. We always write this with an arrow. Okay? So you need to understand what the arrows mean. The arrows, if you see a butt end of an arrow, the flat end, that always goes by the substrate. That's what you started with. Okay? The pointy end of the arrow always points at the product. It went that way. All right? So some of you look at me like, why are you explaining this? That's obvious. It's not always written from top to bottom. Okay? Notice for this reaction to happen, there's 2 arrows, right? Okay? So you ultimately, to start this reaction, you need substrate and you need A. Whatever, they would have names, but I'm just trying to make it generic, okay? So for this reaction to go, you need A and substrate because both of those are at the butt end of an arrow. That's what you started with. As the enzyme turns the substrate into product, it also converts A into B. Does that make sense? Tell me if it doesn't. Okay. Sometimes you'll also see something on both ends of the arrow. So what's ATP? Energy. So now my reaction tells me that as I convert substrate into product, A is also converted into B, and the reaction produces energy. So now do you see why I'm making sure you understand what the arrows mean? Because it's not always just a simple A turns into B. there's usually 3 or 4 things going on at once. All right? Always remember, butt end of the arrow is what you started with. If it's at the pointy end of the arrow, it's something you make. Okay? One other very, very important thing to understand before we go into these reactions. You need to know what ATP and NADH are. Okay? ATP you should be familiar with. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So how many phosphates does it have? 3. What makes it energy is that if you chop one of your phosphates off, it releases heat, and that's where you get energy from ATP. Okay? So if I use ATP, does that ATP molecule just diminish into nothing? No, I chop a phosphate off, right? So if you look at this reaction, when I use energy, I make ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and I release the phosphate. But I just told you the butt end of the arrow is what you start with and the pointy end is what you make, right? So how can this arrow have 2 points on it? This reaction can go either way. Okay? So if I flip back for just a second, this little fake reaction I gave you, for this to really be complete, what else did I need to go into this reaction? ADP. Right? Sometimes they'll only show you half of the arrow. You have to just know in your brain that in order to make ATP, I need ADP. Or the reverse. If I use energy, I'm going to release ADP. That makes sense to everybody. It can go either direction. This is called substrate level phosphorylation. We're going to talk about this a lot. This is taking ADP, putting a phosphate on it, and making energy. This is one way we make energy in our body. Very important. We good? All right. That one should be the one that's more familiar to you. This other guy, NADH, I know you've heard it before, but you've probably never really had anybody tell you what it was. Anybody know what it stands for? You're not supposed to. It stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. Okay, I didn't put it up there. I would never ask you what it stood for. Okay? It has one job in your body. It carries electrons. Electrons are very reactive, very strong, negatively charged particles. They are really damaging to you if they float around by themselves. So we can't let them just float around in our body by themselves. The way this works is NAD combines with an electron. That makes NADH. So if NADH gets rid of an electron, it becomes NAD. So they kind of flip-flop back and forth. And they use the words reduced and oxidized to describe this. Okay? Anytime, and here's the easy way, and chemistry teachers will confuse the snot out of you. But if it's got H's on it, it's been reduced. If it's got no H's, it's been oxidized. So you're going to see those words. It just has to do with whether you lose electrons or gain electrons, is what the words mean. But for now, you just need to be familiar with NADH. It has an electron that it can give away. NAD can carry an electron for us. Does that make sense? Make sure. NADH has an electron. So if it's in this form, it's carrying around an electron. It can go give an electron to something else. If it's in this form, NAD, then it can receive an electron. Okay? So this one has an electron to give away, and this one can accept, if you can read my hand right, an electron. Okay? And you'll see these NADHs in reactions just like we saw the ATP. So you may have substrate go into product, and then an NADH going in. I'm qualified, but I don't. All right? So explain to me what's going on in this reaction. As substrate turns into product, what happens? You use an NADH, so you added an electron to the substrate. Very good. As substrate turns into product, you had to put an electron into it. Okay, and remember, this is kind of chemistry we're doing, so the same reaction. May have some ATP coming out. Okay. You would. They just don't ever show you that. But it's one of those same things you've got to remember. If NADH goes in, NAD comes off. And that NAD can then float around in your cell, go get another electron, and then come back and do this reaction again. So the NADs and NADHs just kind of float around doing their thing. Okay, in the same reaction, they don't show you, but you have to automatically just understand that to make ATP, ADP went in. Is that good? Okay. I don't think anybody ever just explained this to me. And then when you start learning words like 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate turns into 1,3-dis, you got these horrible words, and then you're like, well, I don't even know what this freaking arrow means. How am I supposed to understand the words? So this is the basic. I think you need to understand this. And now, not today, next time, we're going to start learning our pathways. We're going to go over glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, the electron transport chain, fermentation, which will probably be the only new one, and we're going to go over photosynthesis, which a lot of you will say, oh my God, photosynthesis is horrible. Photosynthesis is way easier than what we do in our body. But we're going to go over all of them probably next time. So you need to understand this. Everybody's good? Okay. All right, guys.